I actually have a lot of phones now. I want to start this presentation. This is the first time I've ever had to come to do a presentation, and right before I had to go to the first aid box, like the first aid kit. Because when I was walking here, I brushed by, like I was going through a door and I was thinking, and I wasn't looking at what I was doing, and I bumped against the door and I skinned my knuckle. And it was just bleeding profusely. And here I'm walking here going, I'm going to have to shake a whole bunch of people's hands. I'm going to need a Band-Aid on this. So I went, we have all over Microsoft, we've got these mailrooms that have these first aid kits in them, and they're incredibly well equipped. I mean, there's burn gel in there, there's everything, right? Surgical scissors, and sure enough, strangely enough, I'm opening it, and there is a Band-Aid called a knuckle bandage, right? And I was thinking, wow, you know, a lot of people must skin their knuckles and need a Band-Aid. You can imagine trying to put a conventional Band-Aid on your knuckle would be really hard. The right tool for the right job. This presentation is largely going to be about the right tool for the right job. If you want to do identity management for cloud applications, you need a cloud identity management system. And that's what Azure Active Directory is. And I'm sure you've heard about that over the last, how long have you been here? Is this day 2? This is day 2, right? So Alex Simons, our director, came in and he talked about our vision and stuff like that. What I'd like to talk about today is the very core, if you will, the juicy center of Azure Active Directory. There's a lot of things that now surround Azure Active Directory that are parts of how we do identity management systems and stuff like that. But I'd like to talk about the very core. And at some point, I'm going to go to the whiteboard, and I'm going to start showing you the inside of the system that most people don't ever get to see. There's an outer shell, if you will, of Azure Active Directory where we talk about what kind of protocols it supports and the endpoints it supports, but we don't usually talk about what's inside it and where it came from in the history and the various pieces. I'd like to share a little bit of that with you. It's somewhat trivia, but I hope you find it interesting. I also want to make sure that as we go through this, if you have questions about Azure Active Directory, the core, the platform aspect of Azure Active Directory, that we make sure those questions get answered. I'll be on for about 45 minutes. I can do a quick demo as well. Oh, and we have a microphone for questions. Very well. And I can, if you want, I can build an application that uses Azure Active Directory. It takes about 2 minutes. You can watch me do it on the screen, and you can sort of see what goes on there. In fact, we can build a multi-tenant ISV application, which I don't know if that'll be interesting for many people in the crowd, but there's some aspects of, oh, I want to use a SaaS application. What might be the experience I would have acquiring a SaaS application if I'm using Azure Active Directory? And I can show you what that experience looks like. Let's see. To begin, we'll begin with what is Azure Active Directory and where did it come from? I'd like to thank our sponsors. Thank you. It is an extension of Active Directory to the cloud. I'm sure you've heard this a number of times over the last couple of days, so I won't belabor the point. But the basic realization as we were building, in fact, let me skip past that. Let me skip past that because I know you've heard the vision before. The basic realization that we had when we were building Office 365, this is where the history of Azure Active Directory comes from. We were building Office 365, and we were looking at how we would do identity management for cloud-based applications. These are our flagship, I'd say Microsoft's largest cloud applications are our Office 365 applications. And we looked at a bunch of variations. We looked at, well, maybe we could just build these things in the cloud, and we could somehow have them look back into our customers' networks at their Active Directories and use their Active Directories for identity management. We looked at what that would take and like the network setup and stuff like that. And it was not practical for a variety of reasons, not just what the customers would have to do to get themselves set up, what you would have to do to get yourself set up, but also things like, troublesome things like the speed of light. So anybody here ever worked with Exchange? I'm sure there's a few. And Exchange is chatty. I'm trying to think of a good word for it. Exchange has a low tolerance for latency against the directory. It wants to be able to get its queries against the directory resolved, pronto. Otherwise, there's this sort of backup that happens where eventually people are coming to you with pitchforks and torches because their email isn't working quite properly, and we want to avoid that, so we go all the way back, and we want to make sure that the Exchange servers and other applications that are running in the cloud can get at the directory and get their queries answered quickly. The moment you take something and move it out of, or take, say, software that's running in a Microsoft data center, and you want to ask a question to software that's running somewhere else on your premises, for example, you're automatically looking at like 100 milliseconds or something like that. And as it turns out, it matters. You know, do you know how long something has to take before, there's studies been done, how long does something have to take when you're interacting with a computer system before people start making choices based on performance? What does the difference have to be in like, say you went to a page and it loaded in a certain amount of time, and you went to a competitor page and it loaded in a certain number of time? What's the minimum increment before people start going one way or the other? Do you know? 20 milliseconds. No, actually, I thank God it isn't 20 milliseconds as well, because good Lord. No, it's go ahead. Yeah. No, it's actually lower. It's 250 milliseconds. People start making choices. So at 100 milliseconds just to do the trip, oh my God, your software better be fast, right? Because that doesn't count the part where you're actually doing the work in the CPU. It's just like round tripping. So we came to the realization that we needed to move the directory into the cloud to be resident alongside the apps. And that's how Azure Active Directory was born. It's been running ever since we launched Office 365, and even before that, we were building up Office 365. And I'm sure you've seen some statistics, more than 3 million organizations, more than 100 million users, more than 1 billion authentications a day we do now. Although the secret behind that, like if you actually do the calculation, you go, what? Wow, how come people are authenticating so many times a day? As it turns out, Outlook is not very efficient. At least the current version of Outlook, not very efficient in terms of how it, but we're amongst friends here, right? I can tell you that. And we're changing things as well in future versions of Office to be more friendly. But anyway, but yeah, 1 billion authentications a day, and there are peaks where we see like 40,000 transactions per second, which is, well, we think that's a pretty high number. And then we go talk to like the Azure storage guys, and they're like, yeah, that's not a lot, you know. So, but the rates are pretty high. And imagine building a system that could do that. So that's where Azure Active Directory came from. Let's move the directory into the cloud while at the same time keeping it associated with the directory that many people are running on premises today. And that's not everybody. There's lots and lots of people who have Azure, who have Active Directory today, and they want to have cloud applications. So there's this extending their directory. You could think of this as one directory that has a footprint in both places. It is hybrid. It's on premises, it's cloud, but it's logically managed as one entity. Now, on the other hand, there's also lots of organizations out there, small ones in particular, that have no on-premises footprint. It's 5 people with laptops, and they're doing everything out of the cloud. Well, you don't have to have Active Directory on premises. You can just go get an Azure Active Directory tenant in the cloud. And today, all that requires is 2 things: a credit card and your belief that we're never going to charge you. For the use of, right? And we're going to, but because this is, I could tell you stories about why we have that credit card thing that we do, but that I can't talk about. So anyway, we're working on trying to remove that requirement as well. So all you'll have to do is come to our site, sign up, and you can have an Azure Active Directory tenant in the cloud, and it doesn't require you any, you don't have to do any outlay, and we'll never charge you. If you just use the basic, or I think we call it the basic services of Azure Active Directory, the directory services and the basic authentication services, that costs you nothing. Does that worry anybody, by the way? Like sometimes you should immediately be suspicious when I say I'm giving you something for free, right? There's all those things like if you're not paying for it, you're not the customer, you're the product. You know, the whole thing. But the reason why we don't charge for the basic authentication services is it's the best metaphor, and you know, it's imperfect, but the best metaphor is free parking. If you come and get an identity in our system, you're more likely to buy one of our software services or one of our partner software services that uses that system for logon, right? So we don't want to disincent you to come and park in our lot and shop in our mall. Now, on the other hand, there will be people who will park at our lot and shop next door. They'll run their application in Amazon. Oh, well, we won't stop you from doing that. If you want to run a cloud application anywhere on the internet, or you want to run an application anywhere, and you want to use Active Directory as your login system, Azure Active Directory as your login system, you can do that. We do nothing to prevent that. We encourage that. So any application you want. But predominantly, it was designed to meet the needs of cloud applications. And what we've done in the last couple of years is evolve it so that, oh, good, those colors look better on that screen than this one. What we've done since we launched Office 365 and we unveiled Azure Active Directory is we've started integrating other Microsoft services with it, and we've started allowing third parties to use it, and we started integrating it proactively with third parties like Salesforce. So if you have Active Directory today, and you want to get single sign-on to Salesforce, you can do that by extending your Active Directory to Azure Active Directory and then connecting at your Azure Active Directory to Salesforce, and you're done. You have single sign-on to Salesforce. And a variety of other, there's hundreds of applications that we have now in our gallery where you can go and select them and use them, and use it as your home base for identity management for cloud. Right tool for the right job. You can't do that really effectively with just Active Directory and say ADFS. You can get a certain distance, but the moment the application needs to see the directory, ADFS doesn't help you. And then you're suddenly asking yourself, do I want that cloud application to be looking at my directory directly? Or you're asking yourself, how is it going to do that? Because does Box.com know what LDAP is? Does any developer at Box.com know what LDAP is? Probably not. There's this other thing that's happening with cloud applications and today's applications, which is causing the applications to be built in a particular way, and I'm going to get to that. In fact, one of the questions I wanted to ask of you was, how many people in the audience are working in an organization where you're developing, say, a mobile application that calls a cloud service, or you're expecting to develop one, or you're going to purchase one that does something like that? Or anybody? No, really? No one's using mobile? One. Oh, and it's just shy. It's like, well, sort of, but no one else put their hand up. So no one's building apps on like Android or iOS? Or do you know if anyone is in your organization? Yes, there's a couple of nods in there. Well, there could be a different thing that's happening here, is that you don't know that they are. Maybe. And they are, and eventually it's going to, if you're the people who run identity management in your organizations, they're going to be coming to talk to you eventually and saying, well, I need a way to, or I've gone and I've built this way to sign into this corporate application, and it's not in any way connected to all of the identity management stuff that you've been doing. And that will be a bad day. You can get ahead of that by having a plan and having an architecture laid out for how identity management should work with mobile and cloud applications. Our offering for that is Azure AD, and I'll talk a little bit about what that looks like, really, if you're building an application like that and what the protocols that are involved. I already talked about it. In fact, let's do a little chat about that, and then I want to pull back the covers on Azure Active Directory, talk about what's inside it, and I also want to make sure if there are any questions. I would like to make this relatively interactive. I know you've been getting a lot of PowerPoint, and I'd like to break that cycle for you for the next half hour or so. Are there any questions so far? Go ahead.
Yeah, on the slide you skipped over, you showed data going up 2 miles.
Yes.
But not going up.
That's wow. Okay, so you saw that slide for like a millisecond, and or 250 milliseconds, and you hey, wait a minute, I have a question. That's very good. So
the question is, that arrow
yeah,
going to be bidirectional or not?
the arrow will be bidirectional. We can't tell you when exactly, but we have, for example, seen some very interesting scenarios that we're working on here. One is, let's say that you wanted to do something like self-service group management. And today, to do self-service group management, okay, well, you've got to, with Active Directory, you need to install some on-premises software that will do the workflows and manage all of that. And just setting all of that up and making it highly available and tending to it is some effort on your part. If we could build all of that stuff in the cloud, have you go to the cloud application to join groups and have people manage group memberships, and then that could sync back down to your Active Directory, that's a great scenario. You'd love to pay for that rather than build out your own if you had the choice. That's one. Another scenario that we're looking at is there's a big trend. Of course, as the big trend goes to the cloud and we see various workloads go to the cloud, one of the workloads that's going to the cloud is HR. So you look at a company like a Workday. And so you have your employee, the authoritative source of information about your employees is in the cloud, in the Workday system. And when someone gets hired or when they get terminated, that information is being held up in the cloud. Well, if that application could talk to Azure Active Directory and it could add or remove user accounts or disable them as your employee's status was changing, and then we sync that back down to your AD, that would also be really handy. So there's a bunch of reasons why we look to turn the arrow back the other way. Today it only goes in one direction. Other questions? No? All right. Let's talk a little bit about building applications for Azure Active Directory. So if cloud applications don't speak with Kerberos or LDAP, then what do they do? Like how do you manage sign on to these applications? What do they look like? What kind of protocols are being involved? Anybody want to take a guess at what like some of the protocols might be? Let's see. Is this hip to this audience, or am I talking? Federation, yeah, good one. SAML protocol. OAuth, good. There, I was hoping. Oh, you know, and it's funny because there's OAuth and there's oath, and you have to be really careful with it because they're very different things, but they're like one character different. But anyway, OAuth. So what is I like to call this the gross anatomy of a typical modern application. When I say modern, it's just like when someone's building a new application today, their application generally looks something like this. And this is why I was curious about, do you have people in your organization who are building mobile applications that might be talking to a web service or a cloud service? Typically what we see is over here, this is the application. The application typically doesn't consist of one thing. It consists of many one or more websites or web applications, one or more web APIs, typically a REST API, and then you've got a variety of different kind of browsers, a variety of different kind of mobile apps. So take a look at the Fitbit that I'm not going to win. And yeah, so iPhone 4, iPad 3rd gen, that's great. Galaxy S3, hey, this is kind of old. Anyway, or Windows XP and Windows 8, Mac OS 10. So there's a huge variety of native applications running on just an array of different kinds of mobile devices and PCs, native applications we call them. And then we have people who build applications that call applications. So that's some other server app calling this API. This is the way we see people building applications today. And when you think about this environment, it really lends to a couple things. Number one, I talked about the heterogeneity of the client environment. There's also a heterogeneity of the server environment. All the cool kids are writing their applications in Node.js today. It's all JavaScript, right? Or they invent new languages every other day. It's really hard to keep up. But there's all kinds of applications or languages that are trying to be the right tool for the right job as people are building this kind of application. And there's sort of a drive here. If you're going to build an identity system that works with this environment, you have to go to a lowest common denominator of the architecture, which leads me to, by the way, does this make sense so far? I mean, and what was it that I heard a Forrester analyst say that by the end of 2014, something like 84% of all, and it's like, this is an exact number, right? 84% of all new applications will be built in the cloud. And that just means instead of racking servers, people are swiping their credit card at Amazon or with us, and the servers are getting racked there, right? But these applications are running not in your data center, they're running in some other data center in many cases, these brand new apps. And they take this kind of form, and there's a huge push, again, on things like that mobile device. So what does that drive us to do in terms of the architecture of Azure Active Directory? And this is why Azure Active Directory is different than Active Directory as you know it today. Active Directory as you know it today, as it was conceived in like the mid to late 90s, was designed for an environment where there was a perimetered corporate network with PC servers and PC clients. And that's how you did your computing, right? It was a fairly homogeneous environment, and it was a fairly controlled environment. There were WANs, but there were LANs, and you could be as chatty as you wanted. Ergo the conversation earlier about Outlook and stuff like that. So there wasn't really this focus on things crossing firewalls or going through gateways or well, that's a very particular consideration, or running outside of your network or things like that. So that particular environment was designed up with Kerberos and LDAP and protocols like that, and they were all standards, and it all worked really well. But the world has changed, and now these applications are running on all these different kinds of devices. And it's only just recently that a Kerberos client has arrived in iOS, right? It wasn't there. It didn't exist. It is there now. But you could always depend on these devices, no matter how small, having an HTTP stack in them. So they could send HTTP messages. So the lowest and of course, if it travels over port 80 or port 443, you will let it through your firewall, right? For some reason, right? Like Kerberos is port 88, and those 8 more ports higher is a big difference, apparently. So, because we're not going to let that through. But if it's over 80, well, hey, come on, it's like there's a lane at the border, and they just, oh yeah, you wanted to go through that port, you're welcome to pass through. But so you can pierce firewalls, you can do it in the smallest of devices, and that really drove us to put the the shape of the interfaces on Azure Active Directory to be very web and REST based, very HTTP based. So we want to be able to cater to all those different kinds of devices. So that's why you see protocols like OAuth. That's why you see the directory interface isn't LDAP. It's this thing we call the Graph API, and I'll talk about that in a moment. So that's one thing. Number two, multi-tenancy. We go to great pains in our system to make sure that each tenant is logically separated from all of the tenants. We don't do physical separation inside Azure Active Directory. You can't come to us and say, I'd like to have an Azure Active Directory tenant, but I want my own compute and my own database. I want you to put me over here. Well, actually, that's not true. We will do that, but you have to have a lot of money. Okay? And then what we do is we build a whole data center for you, and we hide it in Virginia. But in plain sight. Actually, yeah, it's Blue Ridge, Virginia. But anyway. Actually, and we never build them in ones. Like we'll never build you one data center because that could fail. So we need two. So we'll build you two gigantic data centers if you present us with enough money. As it turns out, there are some people who have enough money to do that, and we're happy to do that for them. But otherwise, Azure Active Directory itself maintains logical separation between customers, but we go to great pains to maintain that logical separation between customers. It's not one big, giant bunch of Gmail accounts. It's this tenant, this tenant, this tenant. There is no Azure Active Directory, only tenants. I hope someone tweets that, and because I'm just going to keep saying it until someone tweets it. And then finally, and by the way, we believe we're only the custodians of this data. This is not our data. This is your data. We are running the system and maintaining the system for you, but we don't go in and look at that data unless we have to, right? And when we do, it's specifically audited and there's controls against it and stuff like that. Okay, and then finally, our distinguished engineer, a fellow named Murli Sadagopan, he had this interesting statement he made in a meeting a while back that I thought was really kind of, well, it stuck with me, and it probably won't really stick with you right now, but he said, if you take something that is you take something that you can do that's hard to do, no, simple to do at like on-premises scale, one customer. If you take something that's simple and you just try to reproduce that in the cloud, that's going to be hard. It's like you automatically just ramp that up. And if you take something that's difficult to do on a single customer scale or a single tenant scale, and you try to do it in the cloud, it's impossible. Don't even try it. So what you're going to do is find that many of the extensibility points and flexibility points that are in Active Directory are not in Azure Active Directory because we can't guarantee, well, we can't best guarantee, if you will, there are no guarantees, but we can't best guarantee availability, consistent performance, and our ability to continue scaling up, right? We do 1 billion authentications a day, but it actually wasn't that long ago that we were doing 1 billion authentications a week. So we've really ramped up, and the problem here is that as we do that, we always have to be on, right? Authentication, as you guys all know it, authentication has to be completely invisible in your organization. Nobody gets up in the morning and goes, I'm looking forward to logging on today, right? It's the thing, it's the speed bump between them and what they really wanted to do. So it always has to work. It's always got to be there. And it always has to be fast. Remember, the 250 milliseconds makes a difference. So we all have to be completely invisible, and people need to be able to go about their jobs and not know that we're here. And we have to keep doing that as this thing goes from millions of users to hundreds of millions of users. So we're going to keep the whole thing simple. And these are architectural tenets that we held dear as we were creating the core of Azure Active Directory. One thing I failed to mention, in fact, why don't I can segue now to what's under the covers. If you were to actually peel back the covers, yeah, go ahead.
So Azure Active Directory is really only Active Directory in the name, right? It's not, my concept of Active Directory is not matching what you're saying Active Directory.
Yeah, so I could tell you a story about that. Yeah, we're not very good at naming at Microsoft. One of the things, no, you're absolutely right. Conceptually, to answer your question, then I'll tell the story. It is Active Directory in the sense that things that are Active Directory help you with identity management. But it is not a plug replacement for Windows Server Active Directory. In the same way that Windows Azure is not a plug replacement for Windows Server. It's the knuckle band-aid, right? It's the right tool for the right job. I should never compare my product to a knuckle bandage. Darn it, especially not on stage in front of hundreds of people. But anyway, forget I said that one. Look straight into the, where was, now, yeah, it's funny. Now, on one hand, it isn't Active Directory, but we consciously called it Active Directory because we want people to identify Active Directory with identity management. We know a lot of people do identify Active Directory, and identity management at large, I mean. People do identify Active Directory with identity management, so it was a business decision to carry that brand, and that's why that's there. Now, what will happen over time is, I believe, that the functions that you see Active Directory on premise, Windows Server Active Directory doing today, with like domain joined workstations and stuff like that, those functions will evolve and they will be possible in the cloud over time. That's what I think we'll see happening. Like today, you can't join a machine to the cloud. But on the other hand, we also think that joining a machine to a domain is we want to revisit that concept and go, is this really what we need to be doing now? We need to have a security relationship with the services that we're using, and we need to have a management relationship with the services that we're using. But as we see more and more people bringing their own devices to work and stuff like that, you don't want to, many people don't want to bring their personal device to work and join it, and all of a sudden the administrator's got access to my box, right? And see everything that I'm doing. But you still want to have some sort of relationships, and that's where we talk about workplace join and lighter weight mechanisms. So over time, conceptually, all the things that we do around systems management and identity management will become possible with nothing but cloud, but it'll take us some time to get there. Go ahead.
Well, you see the converse being true, that those fancy graph APIs will be available for internal Windows Server?
So another architectural tenet that we hold dear is that you can choose. So if you want to run all on premises, great. Run all on premises. And we will give you a set of APIs that are available both on cloud and on premises. And then you can write your application one way, and then you can choose to deploy it in either fashion. So today, you're right, the graph API, that's the way that you access the Windows Azure Active Directory isn't on Windows Server Active Directory. But you can see, like in the latest release of Windows Server, we added OAuth support on ADFS. So we will, and the thing is, these two will never, they'll be the same in some sort of asymptote. Like one day, they'll be completely the same. But because they evolve at different rates, like we deploy the protocol heads of Azure Active Directory every 2 weeks. In fact, every 2 weeks, new code's going out, right? That doesn't mean that we turn new features on every 2 weeks, but there's new code going out, and then we'll unveil some stuff. But it's a different pace than Windows on like an annual basis. So these things, they'll join up and then they'll diverge, and they'll join up and they'll diverge over time. Go ahead.
So something like workplace join would also be useful for servers to have a more lightweight, so that you can lightweight relationships, so it'd be easier to move them into Azure and move them back out.
Yes. So, and we're thinking about those. So the question was, what about a workplace join type concept for servers? Is that something that we're looking at? And it's something that we are looking at, so that it's easier to move machines around, especially between like IaaS or on premises and stuff like that. Any other questions before I peel back the covers on the inside of Azure AD? No? Okay. Can you see the whiteboard? I'm hoping you can see the whiteboard. I'll draw really big and then I'll erase. That way you can't take pictures. I always tell Jackson, man, don't take pictures in my talks. And then I go and there'll be like some tweet and it'll be a picture and he'll have redacted one little bit of it and he'll have posted it. And I'm like, Jackson, geez, come on. So for that reason, I'm not saying anything that's under NDA today. Although I could tell you the story about the branding of Azure Active Directory. That's a good story. But okay, well, I'll tell you that story. It's very brief. We had, at some point along the line, we had a meeting with our chief product manager, if you will. His name's Steve Ballmer. And he said, he literally was like, the only thing I'm going to tell you is you have to call it Active Directory. And it's like, okay, well, we could do anything else we wanted with it, but we had to call it Active Directory. That came from the top. Okay, so let's, I'm going to draw this big old circle. And this is the physical Azure Active Directory, which, by the way, I will only ever refer to as AAD. There are these folks who like to put the Windows thing in the front, and like Mary Jo Foley grabbed that one really fast, and just wad. You watch her video blogs, wad. Like she just loves it. You can see the little twinkle in her eye every time she gets to say it. For heaven's sakes, I have another story about naming at Microsoft, which I'll tell you later. But I won't go into that now. Azure Active Directory. So if we were to peel back Azure Active Directory, again, logically speaking, there are only tenants. There isn't, each tenant, each person who comes and signs up for Azure Active Directory has their own logical security boundary around what they're doing. And I'm not going to draw that here. Instead, I'm going to draw the physical pieces that are inside it. So the cornerstone, the piece that's most near and dear, or where all the action begins, is this thing called the Microsoft Online Directory Service, MS-ODS, which again, unfortunately, sounds really like MS-odious. But this is the store. It has the tenant data in it. It has the users in it, the groups in it. It is the replicated, highly available back-end store. And this, actually, if you look like really closely at it, it is Active Directory, the one that you run today. It's actually a branch of AD/LDS that we've got clustered and a whole bunch of stuff in it. And by the way, we do take those modifications that we're making that make it really scalable and make it really fast, and those go back into Windows. So, but MS-ODS is the basic directory store. And by the way, oh gosh, I can't remember how many data centers MS-ODS runs in today, but it's probably like on the order of 8 or something like that, probably 2 in every big region. And we replicate data within regions. So we, that way, if an MS-ODS, we had a problem where a whole data center failed or some software in a data center was failing in a catastrophic way, we can divert all of the traffic to another data center in the region. So we have the ability to do, we call it Geo Failover. Now, the way that you access MS-ODS is through a set of front ends that we, again, call the Graph API. So there's a set of front-end servers that are running the Graph API, and this is where you can talk to the Graph API. The Graph API, of course, is talking to MS-ODS through some private means, which is probably LDAP, but I'm actually not entirely sure. Anyway, this is the way you come in. And this interface and what you can do here is, again, consciously limited. You can do more on this particular interface, but because we're trying to keep things scalable and fast, we limit what you can do very specifically as you're coming through the Graph API, and that's MS-ODS. Now, as it turns out, if you were building an application that did, say, a canonical directory-enabled application, like if you think of an Exchange or something like that, it uses the directory for authentication, and it uses the directory for like doing directory calls, looking at actual directory data. So to do the authentication piece, there's actually 3 other services running. And what you're seeing is we're in transit between 2 architectures. When we originally built Azure Active Directory, the authentication system was this thing here that is called org ID. Does anyone know why it's called org ID? So we used to have this service called Live ID, now called Microsoft Account. Live ID, you know, Live ID. This is a fork of the Live ID code. And it was for organizations, so it's org ID. And it also has all the users in it. So if there's a user account in here, there's a user account in here as well. And that's where the user's password lives, and that's a different system. And we built these things separately at the time, given the pieces that we had available to do the job. There's another piece here called the Azure Access Control Service, and it's the thing that if you were to build an application, it's the thing that you do authentication against. So if you're going to do SAML, or if you're going to do WS Federation, or if you're going to do OAuth, then that's coming against this set of APIs. And this has a trust relationship with org ID. And that's where users actually get authenticated. And if you're building a Microsoft application, so if you're Exchange or if you're SharePoint, then you're actually talking to some non-standard interfaces that are poking out of org ID. Now, I forgot the third piece. There's another service running here, which I'll talk about in a moment. If you're looking at this and going, well, why do you have one set of interfaces for the public and one set of interfaces for internal? Well, as it turns out, the internal, this was done for reasons of expediency as we were growing up. And we don't really want to have these interfaces, these private interfaces, live on if we can afford to, because it's a lot to maintain all of this stuff, as you can imagine. We wanted, when people were building applications against Azure Active Directory, for them to come to use these standard interfaces, these industry standard interfaces, and we had an implementation of that in ACS, so we made it all come together. But so there's a relationship between these 2 things where data is sort of roughly being either replicated or being doubly written. So when someone comes in and creates a new user account, an entry is created here and here. That doesn't happen here. And then we have this other thing up here that we call the Evo STS. And the Evo STS, it doesn't have, this thing has its own store, this thing has its own store. There's configuration stuff in here about tenants. There's tenant configuration information and users in here. There's all of that in here, so it's denormalized across these stores. This thing is stateless, and it talks straight to this guy. And what we're going to do is we're going to take all of these interfaces and all of these interfaces, and we're going to move them onto this thing, and then we're going to make these things go away. And then Azure Active Directory will be this store, this API head for directory service access, and this API head for authentication. Now, did you need to know all of that? No. I hope you never have to know all that. You would see it if you were ever debugging a sign-in interaction, because you'd see things like the browser hopping through ACS to org ID, or if you came into Evo STS, it goes to org ID today. And in the future, some of these round trips will get knocked out as we take these pieces away and as we move traffic. This is another big challenge we have. So we can't, when we move this interface point over here, we have to do that without breaking anybody. And again, these interfaces combined are getting 1 billion authentications a day. So somehow, while we're doing 1 billion authentications a day, we need to switch. And of course, how do you do that? A little bit at a time, as it turns out. A little bit at a time. So if you've ever done, if you've ever seen or heard of the concept of slicing or A/B testing, right? So what you do is you put some other gateway in front of all of this, and you take some small percentage of the traffic, if you can target it, great, and you send it to the new thing. And so there's some set of people who are subject to the new system, and everyone else is still coming to the old system, and then you move it over bit by bit, and you can also go backwards and send the traffic back. And you have to keep replicating all of the data so that both systems can do the same work on the same data. Fortunately, this thing is just one of those guys. All right, so that's the inside of Azure Active Directory. Now you know a little bit about what motivated us to build the certain interfaces on it. In fact, I have another slide that'll talk a little bit about what those interfaces are. And you've seen the inside of it. I have 10 minutes left. Any questions now? Still good to go?
So the Evo STS.
Evil? Did you say evil STS? I think you said the evil STS. Sorry. Yeah.
Okay, the Evo STS.
Yeah.
That's a new piece?
Yes, it's new. But you would, again, you would never see it because. Actually, it depends. So again, we have there in front of all of this, there's this thing we call the gateway. And the gateway takes some traffic and sends it to the Evo STS, and it takes some traffic and sends it to ACS, depending on the, right now, depending on which protocol you're doing. So there are some OAuth calls that go to ACS, and there are some OAuth calls that go to the Evo STS. But we hide that, again, from you. But yes, it's a new server. And by the way, this thing and this thing and this thing are all running in Azure Compute. This guy runs on bespoke hardware in our data centers, in the same data centers, but they're not running. This isn't running on Azure Compute today. The databases underneath these things, the data stores are good old JetBlue. It's the same thing that's inside Active Directory today, which is a testament to how robustly Active Directory was designed in like 1998. Other questions? Good to go? Would you like to see me build an application that uses all of this? Shall we do that real quick?
So will
Yep.
ACS as a brand and a label go away?
ACS as a brand and a label will go away, and it'll just be Azure Active Directory at some point. In fact, we rather confusingly call it the Azure Active Directory Access Control Service. And anyway, sorry. It will. The capabilities that are inside ACS will be subsumed by Azure Active Directory. All right, let me just log into my machine here. Okay, yeah, it's 4. Apologies for the colors. We're not sure what's wrong with the input here. So this is Visual Studio 2013. If I was going, and there's some tools we put into Visual Studio 2013 to make the act of building an Azure Active Directory enabled application really, really simple. If you could also do everything that I'm about to do without the tools by hand, there's more steps you would go through. So this is going to appear sort of ridiculously simple. Let's say I wanted to build a new ASP.NET web app, a new C# ASP.NET web app. We'll call it Web App 5, sure. And we'll make it MVC. Now there's this magic button here called Change Authentication, the different ways I can accept authentication in my web app, I can use Forms Auth, I can use Windows Integrated Auth. But I'm going to click this, and I'm going to say I want to use organizational identities, and I'm going to use them with my test Azure Active Directory domain, which I've called squantoso.com. Because we love Contoso, right? But I can't actually use Contoso. That's owned by our marketing group somewhere. So I came up with Squantoso. And let's say that we want it to be able to do single sign-on, and we want it to be able to read directory data. Those are the two things it's going to be able to do with Azure Active Directory. And I press OK. Oh, OK, so now it needs to configure Azure Active Directory to know about the application. Your Azure Active Directory tenant, my Azure Active Directory tenant aren't going to work with just any old app. The directory tenant needs to know about the app and know that it's been approved by an administrator. So I'm going to log in with my administrator account. And there's a bug here where we don't show the hourglass properly. OK. And then away we go. So we have the application. It's going to create it. By the way, so you saw a pop-up there where I authenticated. And it was a web pop-up. How many people here are using Office 365? Okay, so when you log into Office 365, if you're going to SharePoint or OA, you see a web login page. You go through like a Forms login page, and if you have phone factor turned on, it gives you the phone calls and all that cool stuff. That page that you just saw, that login page, it's the same page. We are funneling all of our authentication now, our strategies to funnel all of our authentication through this web pop-up. Even if it's a rich client application, we're going to show a web pop-up. The reason why we do that is so that we can introduce arbitrary new things into the authentication process without having to revise the client, right? So we can add phone-based authentication without having to update Visual Studio. We can add prompts that say, did you hear about this thing we have? What do they call it? They call it the thing where where if you log in, let's say you logged in Texas, and then 2 minutes later you logged in Tokyo. But they have this weird. For instance, it's like the unlikely travel scenario or something like that. They have these funny answers. The heuristic goes off. The unlikely travel scenarios happen. Let's say that happens, and we want to now prompt you to ask you other questions or something like that, and we want to do that without having to update Visual Studio or any other rich client application that might be using Azure Active Directory. We can do that if we funnel everything through that web login view. So now I've got the application. If I just hit F5 to run it, the first thing we're going to see when the browser comes up is the cert warning, because the application's running on HTTPS, but the certificate it's using in IIS Express isn't trusted, but we're going to continue to the website, because that's what everyone clicks anyway, right? Now it's JIT building the site on demand, so that's why this part is particularly slow. But when we get to the application, it's going to immediately send us to log in at Azure Active Directory. And I'll log in with my Squantoso account. And I'll be allowed into the application. The application knows who I am, Squan at squantoso.com. And if I click this, actually to see my user profile, what just happened underneath the covers was the application did a query to the Graph API to look up my first name and last name. Now, that's in this particular code template because we want to show people how to query the Azure Active Directory. My first name and last name were actually in the token that came from the authentication. So I didn't need to do that query, but we have the code in there so you can go, oh, I see how after you've logged the user in, you can then authenticate the application to go get more data from the directory about the user or about other things in the directory. So that's how simple it was to build an application that works with Azure Active Directory. Now, this is the kind of application you would build if you were doing enterprise development, but not if you were an ISV. If you were an ISV, you would build a different kind of application. Let me show you that very quickly. So we'll close this application out.
And do we have any control over what claims go in the token?
Today, it's a fixed set, and there's no control today. In the future, we may give you an ability to do that. So let's create a new project in. I'm going to go do the same thing I did before, except this time when I do change authentication, I'm going to say, this isn't for a single organization. This application is meant for multiple organizations. So it's squantoso.com, and I wanted to do single sign-on and read directory data. OK. I need to authenticate again so that the application gets registered in the directory. And then I'm going to hit F5. So imagine you were you were an ISV, or maybe not even you were an ISV. You were just building an application that you wanted to collaborate with other companies on. You wanted people from other organizations to be able to come use that application. So let me F5 this guy. So instead of just being automatically signing in the user, yeah, whatever, keep going. Instead of automatically signing in the user, there's a sign up process that the user has to go through to use the application, right? Build, build, build. And when I do that sign up operation, so here I see the app, but this is the naked, anonymously accessible front page. And there's a sign in button and a sign up button. When I press the sign up button, it says, okay, to sign up, an administrator needs to consent to this application's access to your directory. So when I press that sign up button, I get transported over to Azure Active Directory. This is, imagine you were installing a Facebook app, same sort of thing. So I'm going to use squantoso.com. And I get this consent page. So I wanted to use the application. I pressed to sign up with sign up with my Azure Active Directory account to that application. And now I'm looking at this screen that says, this application called Web Application 6, published by Squantoso Corporation, would like to have single sign-on access to your information, or single sign-on access to the directory, and then also be able to read directory data. If I'm happy with that, and of course, if I wanted to, I could put a lovely logo for my company here. If I were happy with that, I would press Grant Access. And this is now going to configure the directory. So the directory now knows about this multi-tenant application. And if I then go and press Sign In to this application, then I'll be in the application. There I am, squan at squantoso.com. So anybody who has an Azure Active Directory can come to this application right now and sign up to use it. And then they'll be able to sign into that application with their Azure Active Directory account. This is the way that we tell people who want to build, say if you wanted to build an ISV type application, you want to build a cloud application available to multiple customers, that's all you need to do to set up single sign-on with someone's directory. That's all you need to do. You don't have to get on the phone with them to tell them what the metadata endpoint of the ADFS server is and all that stuff. Anybody who's ever configured federation with a cloud application knows that it's a set of steps that are kind of arcane and sort of unusual and not something you do every day, and it's very easy to get wrong, and it takes a while to process it. This was, do you want to use the app? Yes, done. Today, an administrator is the only person who can press that consent button. Only administrators can install apps. In the future, we'll enable individual users to be able to consent, but when they do, there's only certain kinds of rights they can give to access the directory and other applications. So eventually, someone will be able to say, they'll be able to go to an application and say, I'd like to sign up for it with Azure Active Directory. They'll press a button, and then they'll see a consent page that says, hey, this application would like you to be able to sign in, and it would like to be able to read and put things on your calendar. Yes, and you'll be able to make that work. Go ahead.
So have you done anything to deal with the expired password problem in these sign-on forms?
The expired password problem? So you mean, if your password has expired, then can you change it at that moment? I know that we recently shipped some additional password work around self-service password reset. I'm not 100% certain about password change and what happens on expired passwords. So I would need to get back to you on that one. I'm pretty sure that we have the capability, but I don't want to make an authoritative statement because I'm not sure. My password hasn't expired yet. It should, though. Huh. Or did it expire? Maybe it did. And maybe it did once. Our SDKs will send you a notice when the user who just logged on, like if I touch this application, I've logged on, and this user, their password is about to expire, we actually send a notice, or when we're working on sending a notice, so that you'll be able to put a little thing up in your UI saying, remind the user that their password's about to expire, and here's a link they can go to change it. So we're adding that right now. Other questions? Wow, okay, so I ran a little bit over time. Azure Active Directory, so it's the right tool for the right job. It's for identity management, not just for cloud applications, but for today's modern applications that have APIs that run on a variety of different kinds of native software. The SDKs that we offer today so you can build applications include iOS, Android. We're working on those. All of our SDKs, by the way, if you're building applications, all of our SDKs will be open source. Some of them are now. We're moving others up into open source so people can contribute to them. You can take them, change them, and do whatever you want with them. And we'll do them on all the major platforms. We'll have Java SDKs, PHP SDKs, .NET, Windows, iOS, Android, etc. for all the different popular kinds of apps people would be writing today. The core of Azure Active Directory, the core platform was built with scalability, performance, and availability in mind, is based on standard protocols for access, and as you saw, it's evolving today to simplify the architecture, but that's sort of trivia for you. No one should actually be affected by what's happening behind the curtain there. Go ahead, last question.
As we make plans to move to Office 365, will that include an interface to Azure Active Directory?
So if you were to get Office 365, when you get Office 365, you actually get Azure Active Directory. When you get Dynamics, you get Azure Active Directory. If you get Azure, you get Azure Active Directory underneath whatever you've come and purchased. Each of those applications has usually some sort of native interface you can use to do things like create and delete users, do simple identity management tasks. So if you get Office 365, you can use the Office 365 management portal to do those things. Or you can actually go to the main UI for Azure Active Directory. You can do other things. Like if you wanted to turn on multi-factor authentication, you would do that by you get your Office 365 all set up, and then you would go get an Azure subscription, which, again, put your credit card in, but we won't charge you unless you use something that costs something. And then you can go in and you can add, remove users, and those will magically appear in Office 365, or you can do things like turn on additional features like multi-factor authentication. Okay? All right, very good.
Fantastic presentation. Thank you very much. We round to Stuart.